Hi, this is Lex, and welcome to the Fintech Blueprint. It's your podcast about fintech, decentralized finance, digital banking, investing, robo-advice, artificial intelligence, and all the other frontier technology that is transforming financial services. To get more content, like an illustrated transcript of this conversation in your inbox, subscribe at fintechblueprint.com. So without further delay, let's jump into today's episode. Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's conversation. I'm very excited to have with us Christopher Goes, who is the co-founder of Anoma and of Cryptium Labs. We'll spend today talking about some of the more advanced and interesting topics in Web3, in blockchain architecture, and the economics that relate to those topics. With that, Christopher, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
So let's start at your beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about where you come from academically and what your early interests were and maybe some of your foundational work experiences?
I got introduced to cryptocurrency space, decentralized technologies in high school, not really for any ideologically principled reason, but actually because I was 16 years old and I couldn't get a credit card and I wanted to rent a VPS. And somehow, I think I read one of the Slashdot articles or something. I learned about Bitcoin. And I was like, oh, this seems cool. I could mine some Bitcoin and then I could rent a VPS. So I actually wanted at that point sort of peer-to-peer digital cash, the original thing, right? And for a little while, because I lived in Oregon and electricity was cheap, especially when it's subsidized by your parents, I ran a Bitcoin miner using some boys like ATI before they got bought by AMD. RTX 50, 5870, something like this, GPUs. Had a simple mining rig, mined a few Bitcoins. Sadly, I didn't keep most of them. But so I was introduced to it then, although I wasn't developing any of the protocols. I wrote a few kind of applications on Bitcoin, but I was just playing around. In college, I didn't really do anything related to cryptocurrencies directly. Mostly I worked on autonomous robotics, underwater submarines. Unfortunately, it turns out, although autonomous robotics is a very interesting field, typically they seem to be used mostly by the American military, which is not really my cup of tea. And also the military, perhaps for good reason, but is cautious about deploying systems with any interesting levels of autonomy. They prefer remote teleoperated ones. Probably good, but not so interesting from a technical design perspective. So after college and some brief forays into more traditional startup land, I picked up things in the decentralized technology sphere again, working on the Cosmos project, which I joined specifically to work on IBC. Now, it took a while to actually get to that part. Initially, we were just focused on launching the Cosmos Hub, finishing the proof of stake system, and that took about a year. And then after that, I worked on kind of the architecture and design and coordinating the implementation of IBC, the Inter-Blockchain Communication Protocol, for about another year. During that period, we started Cryptium Labs. We actually started Cryptium Labs because at that point, proof of stake was very new, and everyone was worried that proof of stake would not work because there just weren't enough validators. So it was more of, we were setting up a validator because someone had to do it rather than, it was fun for a while, but it wasn't necessarily a plan to create a long-term validator business or something like this. We were just doing what seemed to be necessary for proof of stake at the time, but ran Cryptium Labs for a few years based out of Switzerland until we sold that to Chorus One. Now about 2 years ago, and since then started the Anoma project.
Amazing. So we, at light speed, went through a bunch of interesting and chunky topics that I want to pause at before we get to Anoma and Cosmos, because I think you've covered quite a bit that's technical. I want to comment on the best arbitrage as the arbitrage of consuming electricity that is subsidized by your parents. Very insightful for all the young listeners out there. There are two things I wanted to open up in what you've said, again, before we get to the more technical stuff. And the first is a question about what kind of mathematical or academic training is needed for somebody who is fluently involved in going between working on autonomous military vehicles and sort of multi-chain validation businesses. What was the background that you had that allowed you to participate in these things? So that's the first question. And then the second question is, you sort of did a yada, yada, yada about startup experience in traditional startup land. And I want to understand kind of what you did there as well. So take those in whatever order is pleasing to you.
To be clear, I never worked on autonomous military vehicles. I worked on autonomous submarines on like a college team where the submarines had to navigate around a pool. We did test it in a Navy pool. That's the closest I ever got to the military. But, during that period, while I was investigating job options in the field, writ large, most of the job options for robotics, especially like autonomous robotics, at that point in time were military, and that wasn't an area that I wanted to work in. So that said, I think there are, I don't know how much experience or expertise, advice I can offer on academic backgrounds. I studied computer science and philosophy, but I think the greatest utility of the computer science courses was that I had a freshman year course in Java that I hated so much that I decided to learn Haskell, just like because, if I was going to do computer science, I definitely couldn't use this language. So I figured I'd try something that was kind of opposite. And that part was useful, but it wasn't part of the coursework. It was a reaction to the coursework. I enjoyed some of the philosophy courses, helpful for kind of thinking rigorously about things, and sometimes some interesting, perhaps unexpected connections to protocol design. I do think the part of autonomous robotics that it ends up being quite relevant to sort of cryptoeconomic systems design is a whole discipline called control theory. I learned some control theory in college, mostly as part of the robotics. A very simple example of control theory is what your thermostat does. So if you have a thermostat, your thermostat has a control input, which is like the desired temperature, and it has a target, which is the desired temperature. It has a control input, which is the amount of heat that it applies, and it has like the ability to measure the current temperature. But it's not the formula, it's not deterministic. So you can't just say like, I want temperature 25, apply, 25 degrees worth of heat, right? Because it depends on the air circulation, it depends on the outside heat, it depends on other heating sources, stuff like this. So instead, your thermostat runs what's called a P, or proportional controller, whereby it measures the current temperature, and basically if the temperature is too low, it increases the heat. If the temperature is too high, it decreases the heat. And it does this forever, right? And it can do slightly more complex things, but that's the simple kind of essential function.
Let me jump in there and offer two examples, and you tell me if I'm right or wrong. So we're recording this the week after Silicon Valley Bank failed and Signature was shut down as well. Your example of the thermostat makes me think of things like the unemployment rate or the inflation rate that the Fed targets, where the things they can control are interest rates in a somewhat related but adjacent bond market, which they control. And that one toggle is just one toggle in a very complex system, which is, end of the day, unpredictable in terms of what the correlations and the black swans are. And so in yanking up interest rates to cool off the economy, one of the unintended consequences has been to, this is my view, but to incidentally destroy a bunch of smaller banks that were holding treasuries, which got devalued because interest rates went up so high for the first time in like 15 years. So that's an example from the traditional finance world. And then alternately, we could look at, as you said, cryptoeconomic system design, right? So things like the price of gas and the mechanisms that set those prices relative to the capital markets for the tokens in which the prices of gas are denominated, ETH or others. Are those the types of things that would be of the kind that you're talking about?
Yes, absolutely. And what's really nice about control theory is that it provides a kind of general way to characterize and describe these systems where you have some inputs, where you have some targets, where you have a complex system, right? So you don't know exactly how the system is going to evolve. I mean, in the case of the Fed adjusting the interest rates, or even the, Ethereum EIP 1559 changing the gas price, what determines who sends transactions on Ethereum or who deposits into their bank is like the rest of the economy. Like it's a really complex system. Yet somehow this very simple control has kind of huge effects and can even lend to, EIP 1559 I'd say works reasonably well. Like gas prices have become, much more predictable, which was one of the goals of implementing that. So despite all of the complexity of the system, it kind of averages out and you can apply these very simple controls. Well, not always, but these very simple controls do at least have clear effects. From the perspective of control theory, all three of these examples, a thermostat, the Fed funds rate, and EIP 1559's gas price adjustment mechanism, are very simple controllers. Like the P controller is typically the simplest kind. Already in robotics, you get to much more advanced controllers, PID controllers, which take into account integral and rate of change of the error, more complex controllers, which kind of build an explicit model of the function of the system. Like when I worked in autonomous robotics, we had a submarine which had 6 thrusters, and we had like something like a PID controller, but we also had a model of how we expect the submarine to move in response to running the thrusters. And we would basically run the PID controller, but also update our model so that as we learn, thanks to the accelerometer and Doppler velocity log, a way to measure the position and velocity of the submarine, as we receive data over time about how the submarine actually responds to those control inputs, we could also update our model. Now, this isn't possible. Submarines are a relatively simple problem compared to like the economy. So it's possible to characterize the system more in somewhat more depth. But still, I think what control theory can offer to the world of cryptoeconomic design is a lot of general mathematical tools, which allow you to look at these problems in a sort of a way which illuminates their shared character, right? You might not think that EIP 1559, your thermostat, and the Federal Reserve are all kind of doing the same thing, but in a certain sense they are.
Really interesting. And I think it creates an architecture also for us to think through some of the topics that we'll engage with shortly. So on that second question, your early startup experience and founder experience, can you talk about kind of what pulled you in that direction and what were some of the early structures and projects that you try to make happen?
Initially, I worked with a very good friend of mine from college on a automatic bookmark classification tool where you would, instead of using the normal bookmarking function, you would bookmark it with our tool, and we would use some, early quote unquote AI, but basically statistical inference models working with multi-layer neural networks to classify the page into one of many categories, like could be a book, could be an article, could be news, could be music, stuff like this. And then we would automatically sort your bookmarks based on this. So it was a SaaS product, right? But we decided, my co-founder, Rahul, and I decided that we did not want to sell data, which was probably the downfall of the service, because we had 10,000 users or something like this. And we could have sold their data and, continued to give away the product for free, but we didn't want to do that. So instead we charged them. No one really wanted to use it anymore. I'm sure we could have done it in other ways. But yeah, I mean, honestly, my conclusion from all of this was I was just I didn't want to go into academia. I'd had some early physics research experience. And while I loved physics and still do, I didn't, I found kind of the structure of funding. I was working on a grant that, required that as part of working on the grant, you study this specific data, but there was no reason why you would want to. It was data that someone else had already studied. As far as I could tell, it must have resulted from some kind of process where a bureaucrat looked and said, okay, well, we have blah, 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 millions of dollars of funding, and we have this data. Let's parcel out the funding and assign a piece of funding to each piece of data and then tell some scientist to go do it, right?
Another example of the butterfly effect, right? This grant existed that had no meaning behind it. But you did say something in there that I want to catch on, which is that you didn't want to sell customer data. So this ties to some of the things you're doing now. What is wrong with selling customer data? Or said another way, what is good or valuable about privacy?
Privacy sometimes, I think, is a confusing word that we've ended up using to refer to this class of technologies, because privacy sometimes implies that, something can't be seen. And that's not, whether or not something can be seen is not purely a function of the technology. It's mostly a function of what people choose to do. So I think basically the differences between different technologies are mostly differences in whether the user is aware where their data is going or not. Right. And on the one hand, you have, so-called privacy technologies like Zcash and Anoma and Anoma, where, users can disclose their data to whomever they want. So it's not necessarily private, right? But what you could call these, although it's more wordy, is like consensual information disclosure technologies, right? Where the user is made very aware when they take actions using the protocol of where their data is going to whom, and it's completely up to them, right? That's not being sort of accidentally disclosed or not being sold or not being disclosed just by the virtue of using some system which, probably looks like it does something else, right? And on the other end of the spectrum, you have, SaaS companies, Google, Apple, Microsoft, random apps on your phone often, which tend to, I would say, deliberately obscure the fact that your data is going somewhere else. Like you download a recipe app, and in fact, it makes money by selling location data to, the American police or something. I mean, this actually happens. It's not. You can find a recent disclosure by the FBI that they purchased location data, right, without a court warrant or anything. They just bought it from some apps, and that, to me, is, the primary difference between these systems is, well, if the user read the code of the application, they could figure out that their data was going somewhere. But it's, crafted on purpose by the architecture of the physical devices, by the architecture of the app store, by the developers of the application, the business people who chose to pursue that business model. It's crafted on purpose to hide the fact that their data is being disclosed to users. Even with, and sometimes what really matters is kind of like if you want a network or a protocol which honors users' consent, you need to meet them in the middle, as in it's necessary that the user understand what choices you are allowing them to make. And it's necessary that it be possible to kind of use the system while retaining privacy. So even something like the GDPR here in Europe, while, perhaps well-intentioned, in my eyes at least, has not always solved the problem, right? Often you go to websites and you receive a lot of things to click through, and then the same data is disclosed anyways, right? Because it's very impractical to analyze all of this, and a lot of the internet you just can't use unless you accept some of these terms, right? So that's not, to me, that's not preserving consent, because you're limiting the user's ability to use the system, which you don't need to do, right? But the companies are just choosing to do it. You're limiting the user's ability to use the system based on what data they disclose to you. So I think there's a whole spectrum of things, but I was personally, at the time, just I think selling data is a dishonest thing to do. I mean, if it's explicit, it's okay. If you're telling the users that, basically you're paying with your data, and here is who the data is going to, and here's, what risk that might entail for you, then, I mean, at least it's kind of an informed decision, but that's never how it works. And these SaaS products, they keep it as hidden as possible. And I think that's, it's lying, and beyond being kind of wrong at the individual level, it has really terrible social ramifications. People know that they're being watched, right? And all of this data is used by companies to perform various kinds of surveillance capitalism, basically to try to manipulate public opinion, to sell data on, what's popular to various propaganda groups, mostly, ones of different political alliances. And the net result is it's both, privacy has consequences which are both individual and collective. It's not, I think often people focus on privacy purely at the individual level. And then, that can lend one to the question of, well, if I'm not doing anything wrong, why do I need privacy? But that's not, I don't even think the individual level is the most important. I think kind of the social effects of privacy change how people talk. It's easy to think about it in a local context. Like you say different things to different friends, right? You try not to hurt somebody's feelings. If someone asks you to keep something secret, you don't tell it to somebody else, right? People understand this very instinctually. And that intuition, I think, is correct, right? The problem is that we've built technological systems which don't respect it, and which mislead users often into just not expecting that their data is going to be disclosed in ways which it actually is.
Yeah, so here's a trivial example, but is amazing, right? Which is to wiretap a phone conversation, you would need a warrant from a court. And so you would have a check on the executive desire to police citizens in some particular way. It's reasonable to say that having some intrusion from the executive to police the population sometimes is the right decision, but having a check to push back against that desire is really important, and that's why you have the judiciary system. That's why you have the warrant for the wiretap or for entry into a home or whatever it is. Meanwhile, to open up a whole bunch of WhatsApp data, a bunch of conversation data, or to post direct messages on a social media platform is trivial and is completely normalized. Even in this example of in the past, you could have a phone conversation and have some sort of constitutional protection about what you say not being completely aired out. That's gone. And it's gone not because of some change in ethics or philosophy. It's gone because of how our platforms have evolved.
Also, I think privacy is important for sort of both sides, or so to speak, of the citizenry and government. Although, if there are two sides, you're kind of already having problems. But let's face it, there are sometimes. So in particular, I think privacy is very relevant for, people in government, or people thinking about kind of the health of the country, for two reasons. The first is national defense. So when you use these systems which are not private, the American government can buy your data, and the Chinese government can buy your data, and the Chinese government can buy data of American citizens, very easily. It's not, or they can, hack into the databases. The North Koreans will do whatever they want. They're not subject to American court orders or whatever. So in fact, building all of your civilizational infrastructure on top of kind of flaky and too transparent technological systems is really bad for your ability as a country, right? If you're thinking about the health of the country, to have, coherent internal communications that aren't snooped on by some adversary. It's like some foreign government could see what your citizens are doing. They could try and manipulate public opinion, manipulate elections. All of this is possible only because so many of these pieces of technological infrastructure have been built in ways which just don't keep data private, right? So privacy is really relevant for national defense. And it's also really relevant for collecting accurate data. So let me give an example of this. If I'm a government, often I want to know what my citizens are thinking. I might want to know what they want, so I can try and keep it in mind, especially in a democracy. What they want is relevant to my ability to continue as a government, right? I might want to know, kinds of social problems or things I should be concerned about. And in particular, if I am acting in good faith, at least, I want true information. So I want to know what's actually happening. I don't want people to lie to me, right? Now, privacy is helpful, even necessary here, because it can give people credible protection for telling the truth. So if I'm the government and I want to know, how many people are using cocaine, right? But cocaine is illegal. So if I just conduct a survey that says, did you use cocaine last month? Are people going to tell the truth? No, right? The government does stuff like this thing, but they do stuff like this all the time, right? They collect data about practices of the population where, at least assuming good faith, one would expect them to want true data, but the way in which they ask the questions or the way in which they architect the systems is just unlikely to elicit that, right? So privacy is helpful as a tool in kind of the, system architect's toolbox, because it allows you to provide kind of credible protection for people telling the truth, and then allows you to elicit truthful information out of these systems, which you wouldn't be able to if people know that they're being surveilled, right? So I think privacy is important. It's not, as easy to frame the problem as people versus governments, and privacy is a tool for citizens against their governments. And I think that's true, and that's important. It's important to kind of craft systems that protect against government overreach. But privacy is also a tool for governments. It's a tool for the integrity of communities at any scale. And it's a tool for providing kind of credible protection for freedom and truth at any scale. And I don't think, countries with private systems are going to out-coordinate, frankly, and out-compete countries where everyone is surveilled all of the time, because the citizens will be free and they'll be able to develop things which are kind of more in the interests of their fellow countrymen, because they won't be worried about doing something the government doesn't like, right? I think privacy is very win-win.
Super interesting. We've established some values and benefits of privacy, and then we've established sort of that architecture, the control systems architecture. Let's switch over to Cosmos and the multi-chain vision. You were involved for a while with building in that protocol. Can you talk about, at a high level at this point, the distinction in the visions of, I don't know if it's fair to say, the Ethereum community versus the Cosmos community, but maybe there is a line to draw between people who think there is kind of a winner-take-all single network versus those that think that there's a multi-chain future. And is that even the right question about Cosmos? Like, what's motivated the growth of that community, and what are the differentiated principles that underpin its development?
I mean, I think, and kind of fortunately so far, that Ethereum community, the Cosmos community, the Anoma community are really highly overlapping and very aligned on many topics. And there are many people who would consider themselves part of all three communities or part of several of them, and not, there's a lot of like shared vision. And I think we can all cooperate both on the community level and on the protocol level. We don't need to be competing with each other. Yeah, I think there are differences certainly in parts of the communities on opinions about what the role of blockchains are and what the relation between blockchains and assets are. So let me dive into that a little bit. So the first part is what is the role of the blockchain, right? So the kind of the Ethereum thesis, at least at the moment, is that Ethereum will be kind of the global settlement layer for a bunch of layer twos, and Ethereum will provide kind of a trust anchor for all of these layer twos or layer threes, layer fours, et cetera. And it will have this kind of deflationary monetary policy based on burning Ether. And maybe some people, I guess not everyone, think that Ether can become at least a very widely used, if not the dominant world currency, something like this. Then the Cosmos vision is that there will be sort of an internet of blockchains, that those blockchains will do many different things, and the blockchain should be interoperable, and there will be many different monies, and they will, just like exist for different communities, something like this. Anoma is, certainly on a monetary policy side, more aligned with Cosmos, as in we're not, the Anoma, there will be kind of an Anoma network token that we coordinate, but the protocol is designed to be open and designed to make it easy even to switch between different representations of value. Where Anoma and Cosmos differ is that Anoma standardizes more, as in Anoma standardizes all of the protocol stack so that you have Anoma applications, but those applications can be used on different security models. So in the Cosmos world, there are many different blockchains which have different security models, right? They have different validator sets, but they also have like different application stacks. So applications and state are not portable across the blockchains, right? And I think the idea of Cosmos is that there will be many different blockchains which specialize in a particular application. And I think that that's a good approach to explore. But I also think that there's a lot of value in standardizing more of the protocol stack because it makes it easier to exit. So if users have, their state and assets in a particular blockchain in Cosmos, it's not because that blockchain has its own protocol. Even if they want a different security model or they want to make some change, it's not necessarily easy for them to switch because there aren't necessarily other blockchains which are compatible with the same protocol, right? So Anoma standardizes more so that people write applications for Anoma, right? But for Anoma doesn't mean tied to any particular token or any particular security model. Those applications, it's more like Anoma is kind of a distributed privacy-preserving operating system, and those applications can run across many different security models. So I think these are all good approaches to explore. And so it's good that the three projects are doing somewhat different things. Then we'll see what works, and they can all interoperate. I'm pretty skeptical about the Bitcoin and Ethereum currency maximalist ideologies. I think we should move towards having more currencies, not fewer currencies. Right now, the world has quite centralized monetary policy control, as evidenced by, some of the recent actions of the Fed. And I think that, one way to illuminate how that maybe is not great is by asking, well, what should the economic system be doing and what should it be tracking? And in particular, if the economic system is tracking and coordinating sort of the exchange of physical goods and to some extent the exchange of virtual goods, of ideas, knowledge, stuff like this, just in a broad sense, then you could ask the question of, well, how much do the ground conditions change, right? So the financial system, as it is subject to these sort of large fluctuations. And those large fluctuations don't correspond to anything physical, right? I think you could just think about this. You don't need to do, a complicated deduction or anything like that. Like physical change is slow, right? Of course, there are many concerns. There's sort of a lot of ongoing worry about the potential changes to the atmospheric condition and results on temperature. There are geopolitical concerns. There are lots of concerns, but, maybe a valid reason for like a vast swing in the economic system is someone starting a war, right? That's like a sudden change, right? That influences what might happen. But this past week in the US, there was no sudden change in the physical conditions. There was no sudden idea that would drastically change energy production or something like this, right? There was no actual change in the actual flow of value, right? There was merely a change in the sort of system that we have, which is supposed to be tracking it. So at least to me, this means that the system is failing. The system is not accurately tracking what we want it to be tracking and coordinating. And I would argue that part of the reason for that is because there are a very small number of centralized sort of levers of control, such as the Fed funds rate. And those levers of control are have impacts on the system which don't correspond to any underlying changes in the flow of kind of physical goods or the flow of ideas and information. They just correspond to like what someone is trying to do at a certain macroscopic level. And we could have different opinions as to whether or not whether or not they're doing the right thing in the current context of the system. But to me, the fact that the context of the system can fluctuate so much independent of ground truth or ground value is an indication that like the whole game is just wrong, right? There is no right move in fractional reserve banking because there's no right move in the wrong game.
I want to go back to some of the things that you've said about what blockchains are for and about the structure or the visions of how they can work, in particular on like double clicking, like what does it mean for something to be interoperable? What does it mean for something to be an application that moves from here to there? So I want to put a pin in that and kind of address it after your more immediate point about, the system failing. I guess the way I think about it is that our technology, like humanity's technology to deal with its self-organization, is a technology like any other. So it evolves over time. And its resolution, like its granularity, is also a function over time. So if you think about the map and the reality, right, the Eliezer Yudkowsky kind of point about some representation of a particular terrain that's drawn on a map isn't the actual forest. It's not going to actually tell you what it's like there right now. It's not going to tell you if it's rained. It's not going to tell you what kind of animals there are. It just tells you sort of an abstraction about its shape. And we rely on all these abstractions to navigate things based on how our minds work. We can think about an abstraction of the human body. That's an object we can sort of render in our mind. And then we can think about the abstraction of molecules or atoms. And then we can think about some abstraction, which is the number of people who were customers of Silicon Valley Bank who have locked up deposits. We don't have like this contiguous impression that goes from, the people who are customers of SVB at the same time all of their physical details, and at the same time, all of their molecular details, right? Like we can't render that much information. So we sort of rely on maps, on models. And similarly for kind of the governance of human scale systems, like, what's the Fed for? How do we quote unquote manage our economy? Arguably the American approach to doing that, it has a lot more fidelity, has a lot more granularity than, let's say, the USSR in 1965 trying to centrally plan everything in the paper version of a spreadsheet. At the same time, the complexity of things have exploded to such an extent that to think that you could figure out the world and manage it with like the macroeconomic models of the 1980s or 90s just becomes absurd, right? So to your point of like the disconnect between the physical thing and then the remedy, like the physical thing is, or one of the physical things was the invasion in Ukraine has blown up the supply chain of oil and the price of oil. So literally, gas and oil aren't being delivered to all sorts of various markets. In all those different markets, the price of those commodities is going up, not because of like the abstract idea that interest rates are too low, but because literally there's not the oil. Or during the COVID crisis, like the ability of a factory to ship from China to the US a bunch of plastics to put together some thing that then is sold in Walmart, like literally that ship is stuck, like it's not going, right? And so you've got inflation from these very particular phenomena. And then the only lever you have is like messing around with fixed income markets. You're not fixing anything on the ground. You're completely like top down, like you've got a map that is such a pixelated version of the actual world that you end up generating chaos rather than kind of addressing the underlying. Is that fair? Is that kind of attached to some of the ideas that you were talking about?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think the map territory metaphor, or the map forest metaphor is helpful. The ingredient I would add to it is that, so I think it's important to understand the relation between sort of culture and technology as it relates to the map territory metaphor. So as I think of it, at least, the map is basically technology, right? The map is like a representation of the world. And, the banking system in the United States is at least used as a representation of the world, right? Regardless of whether it is or not. Let's sort of leave the question of, a correspondence, which is a very important one, but bracketed for now, right? So the banking system is used as a representation of the world. Then the question is not only whether a map works, right? Whether it allows you to successfully navigate the forest depends not only on whether the map corresponds in some kind of like form sense, like whether the trees on the map, are spaced in the same way or in a way proportional to the trees in the forest, but it also depends on whether people understand how to read the map and how they interpret the map while they're walking through the forest, right? And one of the challenges with something like fractional reserve banking is that people don't understand, as in most people, very reasonably, right? I'm not saying that they're wrong, but most people, small businesses depositing into Silicon Valley Bank, most banks are not reading the bank's balance sheets. They're not thinking about how the Fed controls interest rates and how that could affect the liquidity and solvency of banks, which bought low interest rate Fed. They're not thinking about these things, right? They have businesses to think about, families to think about. They're not experts in macroeconomic policy, right? So their understanding of the map, in this case, how their bank account works, is functionally in some sense, not exactly wrong. I mean, if the Fed bails everybody out, I guess it wasn't wrong, right? But there's this mismatch between expectations of how the map or technology is supposed to be working and how it legally works, or at least legally worked prior to the age of bailouts and quantitative easing. But to some extent, this age is kind of, I'm not saying that the Fed is doing the wrong thing. I mean, it probably would be terrible if the entire banking system collapsed, at least right now, when there's nothing credible to replace it. But it is, it stems from this mismatch in expectations of how the system behaves and how the system actually behaves. And regardless of whether or not the system corresponds to reality, right? Regardless of whether or not the map actually represents the forest accurately, if the person reading the map doesn't understand how to read the map, it's not going to work, right? So you have these two things, these two steps which need to work. The culture needs to work in understanding how the technology represents the world, right? Or the map represents the world. And then the technology of the map needs to kind of accurately correspond to the world. And what you observe, here I'm kind of simplifying and carving things into broad categories, but what you observe is the composition of these two things, right? So people use the map or use the technology in accordance with how they understand it. And then the technology represents or affects the world in accordance with how, the sort of more specific material relations. And all of this forms of feedback systems. So culture also informs how we produce technology, et cetera. It's quite complicated, but I think it can be helpful to understand that distinction as well.
Okay, so let's go back to the protocol and talk about maybe kind of reintroduce the problem that you're focused on, and if there are some kind of specific examples or comparisons that you could make about how the protocol is differently designed and then what kinds of outcomes you see coming together if it's successful?
So Anoma, I guess I would say, is designed under the assumption that what people, the primary use that humanity will have for distributed blockchain systems or distributed database systems with consensus is economic coordination. In particular, that what consensus or ordering allows you to do is track things which are scarce, as in it allows you to track like linear resources, which have controlled issuance. And that can be useful when you want to track things in the physical world that are physically scarce, like oil, for example, or like sandwiches, or things which are kind of scarce in production, like it takes time to produce ideas, right? So time is a scarce thing that you might want to track in a way that reflects that scarcity. So we make that assumption. And we also make the assumption that people are basically fine agreeing on a protocol, but that they will not agree on who to trust. So this is actually the same assumption that something like TCP/IP makes. TCP/IP is a sort of vertically integrated full stack protocol that handles all the things that you need to do for communication between networked computers. But it does not specify who, as in which servers you should connect to. And we observe in practice that people are just fine agreeing on TCP/IP. There are basically large, benefits to network effects of using the same protocol. Because if there were another protocol to replace TCP/IP, maybe it would be like 10% faster, right? But it would do functionally the same thing. So you can agree on a protocol in a way that kind of benefits everyone, as long as the protocol doesn't require that you make specific security decisions or trust decisions. And trust decisions are all about identity. So it's about like which server you connect to and who you send data to, right? It's about that. And those decisions, we think are always going to be heterogeneous. Currency, for example, which currency to use, because currency is always held by somebody and issued by somebody. Currency is also a decision about trust. So Anoma kind of tries to standardize all the things that we think everyone benefits from standardizing or from agreeing on, all of the parts of the protocol, including how applications work, right?
What does it mean to standardize?
It means that we write down a protocol which describes how to do all of those things in a way that will allow different parts of the system to interoperate. So to allow state to be moved across different security zones or to different people, to allow applications to be moved across security zones or to different people, to different validator sets, etc. Depending on what users choose, of course, but everyone kind of, if you run Anoma, everyone agrees on enough of the protocol that you can move applications around, which you can't do in something like Cosmos.
Who bears the burden of updating their application or changing their behavior in order to fit into the standards that Anoma articulates? How do you pull the different projects into adopting this stuff?
So there are two parts to that question. Anoma is a full stack protocol, which is new. So developers writing applications for Anoma will need to, rewrite their applications. Of course, there are perhaps many concepts and ways of organizing code and applications that developers might already be familiar with, like functional programming or dealing with zero-knowledge proofs, so these sorts of things, smart contracts. Those will be relevant to writing applications on Anoma. So it's like learning a new language and a new system architecture. Hopefully not too hard. But applications do have to be written for Anoma. There's a particular format, and it's not a format. There are similar things in the world, but none of them are exactly the same. But we also want Anoma to be compatible with basically as many existing systems as possible. And the way in which we plan to allow for that is by splitting up the protocol into modular components, which can be used independently. So, for example, it's possible to write an Anoma application and then settle or sort of verify a proof and execute the state changes on Ethereum. So you can use Anoma kind of like a rollup if you want, right? Or you can use Anoma as a sort of sovereign chain settling to some validator set, or you can use just, Anoma consensus, which is called Typhon, with existing Cosmos state machines, right? So you can pick and choose parts of the protocol. And we've tried to make the stack modular in a way that facilitates gradual and progressive adoption. And everything's open source, so people can just import it and use it, no permissions required.
What is the role of zero-knowledge proofs in the protocol?
Zero-knowledge proofs do two things in Anoma. They provide for computational compression, which is kind of the simple part. That's like using rollups typically are the most common use of ZKPs for computational compression, and we support that. And they provide privacy for individual user state. That's similar to something like Zexy or VeraZexy, but we kind of solve the more general problem for the case of counterparty discovery as well, also using zero-knowledge proofs. So yeah, computational compression and privacy.
What are some of the things that you're doing to grow the ecosystem? And if people want to learn more about how to contribute, like where should they go? What is it that they can do?
So one thing we're doing as Anoma is not completed yet, and we would like to provide some privacy in the short term to people who need it, is that we're launching a blockchain called Nomada, which uses Tendermint but provides a multi-asset shielded pool for interchain sort of asset-agnostic private transfers, connects to Ethereum and to Cosmos, so you can send assets from any of those ecosystems. And Nomada is just in final public testnet stage, and we're running a retroactive public goods funding program. So if you go to blog.nomada.net, you can find an article on the retroactive public goods funding program. Please submit nominations. Part of the Nomada Genesis proposal by the Anoma Foundation will include at least 20% of funds allocated to just retroactive public goods funding. So people who've done valuable open source work, privacy advocacy, even stuff like art, we conceive of it broadly in the past, could be eligible. And you could submit your nominations on the forums. We also have a lot of, you can follow us on Twitter, Anoma and Nomada, to learn more about upcoming events. And we have a lot of code available on GitHub. Feel free to submit issues or pull requests or questions just there. And there are several kind of discords which you can access on the website for different parts of the protocol stack.
Thank you for such a wide-ranging and deep conversation. And I encourage everybody who's listening to learn more about the project and find ways to contribute. Christopher, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. That's it for this week's episode of the Fintech Blueprint. For more technical deep dives into all things fintech and decentralized finance, check out fintechblueprint.com and grab a free subscription to the newsletter. This is Lex, and I'll see you next time.